Hey everyone, welcome to the weekly installment of Intro to Labor Studies. Your assignment for this week was to finish the book Fashionopolis. I hope that you have all stayed healthy and that your family members are staying healthy and that you're doing okay stress-wise, that the semester isn't wearing you out too much. So a couple of announcements. Assignment 3 is due Friday. And your service learning project is due, it says 2 weeks, it's really more like 3. So this week, Friday, is when your assignment 3 is due. Next week, we have some short articles to read from Naomi Klein. And then the week after that, your service learning project is due. Over the next couple of days, I will be emailing you with assignment 2 with your grade and any comments. They were overall really good. Most of you did really well. Also, just to check in terms of how you're doing on participation in the weekly posts, and also a check-in about your service learning to see if you're on track, see what you need to finish in order to make sure that you can complete the assignment. And when I email you, I will reattach the service learning assignment, but it is available also in Blackboard. I did notice that a lot of you are behind in terms of the weekly posts. And I also, I don't spend a lot of time checking in on who's logging in and watching the videos and whatnot, but I do see that the numbers are pretty low. So I know that it's stressful. I know that this isn't normal times. So in a normal semester, we might think about different ways to approach that. What I've decided to do this time is just keep things light this week so that you have time to work on assignment 3. And if you recall, your post from last week should have started you down the path of figuring out what you're going to write about in assignment 3. I'm also going to try to go through and do some responses and suggest some ideas, which you don't have to follow. I might link you to some sources. You don't have to use them, but just some thoughts to kind of keep things going for you. So you don't have to post anything this week. You can catch up on previous weeks if you're behind, and we'll just take it from there. Okay. So a couple of things. I'm going to keep this lecture super brief. I think that we are all kind of the work's piling on, so I just want to give you a few key points from the reading and sort of give you here's the gist and here's what I was hoping when I assigned the book that you would take away from each of the remaining chapters. I think that's actually just the easiest way. Again, if we were in the classroom, obviously we'd be doing this differently in a more interactive way. But for now, I think this works. So in chapter 6, it's called My Blue Heaven. Essentially, Dana Thomas is describing a bunch of different dyeing and finishing processes, and she talks about the environmental impact that each of those has, both on the towns where the factories are, and of course on the individual workers, which we've talked about a little bit in terms of workers breathing in fibers, having lung issues like interstitial lung disease and pneumatic diseases coming from breathing in toxins and chemicals. And so she talks about a few different companies who are figuring out better ways to do that. And some of that includes growing indigo as a product rather than relying on synthetic chemicals, which almost the entirety of the industry depends on synthetic dyes at this point. So she gives us a peek into some folks who are trying to do things more organically. In chapter 7, so this is the chapter where she talks about Stella McCartney's brand, and she talks about the way in which Stella McCartney is really invested in sustainability on all of the different fronts. So famously, Stella McCartney is the daughter of Linda McCartney, famous vegetarian, vegan activist. And so Stella McCartney and her brands is all about like no leather, no fur. And she also talks about, some of the issues that she has with the silk industry and trying to find an alternative that's friendly to animals and friendly to the planet. And she describes the way in which her brand developed what she calls an EPNL, an environmental profit and loss statement. That's basically just a balance sheet that says, here's some different environmental practices that we use. Here's all of the different markers like water usage and toxins released into the atmosphere, all of those things. And so here's kind of where we think we are. And other brands have now picked that up, or different versions of that. And as always, we want to be a little bit critical of that. And if you've heard the term greenwashing, basically it means when a company is putting on a particular kind of performance of being environmentally friendly, or as opposed to greenwashing, there's not really a term for it, but a company will put out a statement about the fact that it treats its workers and the supply chain really well. And Thomas gives us a quote from Robert Reich, who says, a lot of the time when companies are talking about sustainability and they're talking about fair workplace, most of the time that's kind of a lot of bull. And it's designed to make them look really good so that you feel better as a consumer about buying their products, right? And that in reality, this is more performance than anything else. Chapter 8, so she talks about circular or closed loop systems that basically say, instead of producing new materials, the ideal would be to find a way to recycle and reuse old materials. And she actually goes into like molecular detail of reusing cotton, reusing linen, being able to separate polyester from cotton. And just recognizing some of the materials and their ability to regenerate themselves. So obviously, she talks about cotton having a particular, cotton takes a lot of water, which we'll look at a graphic in a second. Rayon comes from actually wood pulp. So a lot of the companies that produce rayon material have now, under public pressure, taken a vow that they're not going to destroy rainforests anymore in order to produce that rayon. Still a huge issue. And then polyester and basically spandex, anything that goes into like yoga pants, leggings, athletic wear, all of that stuff is really made out of plastics. And she doesn't actually talk about this, but most of us don't think about clothing when we think about plastics, or at least I didn't. And what scientists are finding is that things like fleece in particular, and other kinds of fabrics that are based on or derived from plastics, derived from petroleum, actually release microfibers. And the more that you wash them, the more microfibers they release, and those go into the water stream. And they're microscopic, so we consume them. The oceans are full of them. They've found microfibers in like the deepest parts of the ocean that humans have barely visited. So this is a huge problem that we just did not see coming. I think when folks were designing polyester, she does talk a little bit about this, in the war era, it was in order to, I think she talks about this in the context of nylon actually, but producing synthetics in order to reutilize materials for the war effort. And certainly in the 40s and 50s, when a lot of these products were starting to be developed, there wasn't any sense of a microfiber or the environmental toll that this would take. Chapter 9, called Rage Against the Machine, comes back to this issue of automation, which we've of course talked about before. So she looks at different models for using robots and using technology in order to lessen the footprint of the fashion industry. And the goal that she has actually repeated a few times throughout the book, if you notice, is there will be fewer jobs, but there'll be better jobs, hopefully. So whereas you might have a sweatshop that's full of people doing really dangerous work at very low pay. When we automate, there are fewer jobs available, period, but the jobs are much better. They're higher paid, they're cleaner, they don't take this kind of physical toll that the sweatshop jobs do. And it also means that we can produce clothes that are made to order. So instead of printing, she gives the example at some point of, every time there's a Super Bowl or a Stanley Cup or a championship, they print both teams, right? They print the winning t-shirts for both teams, and then they just sort of dump the t-shirts for the team that didn't win, and they get shipped off somewhere to another country and we never see them. So she's talking about more and more higher end fashion using a system where you order a sweater and there's not a warehouse with 3,000 of that sweater sitting somewhere. There's a machine that will create that sweater for you only when you've ordered it and then ship it to you. And then the last chapter, she calls to buy or not to buy. And I think it's interesting. And I have some questions to pose to you all. But she says, ultimately, it would be better if we just didn't buy things. But the solution that she poses is clothing rental. And she gives a few examples of high fashion gowns or suits. I have friends who are in the stage of their life where they're in professional positions, and I know some people who have tried those services where they ship you a box of clothing based on a questionnaire that you fill out, and you try everything on and you keep what you like and you return what you don't like, but you don't have to go to the store. You don't have to walk around and shop. She also, I'm really interested in this. She talks about millennials, but I think the new generation, she doesn't really talk about Generation Z, but she seems to refer to them. She seems to kind of mix them up. But, she says millennials are still really invested in going shopping in stores. And I'm very curious, and I wish that we could have a face-to-face discussion, because I wonder if that's true in all of your experiences. Certainly, I don't shop in stores very often, occasionally, but I do prefer to try clothes on before I buy them. Full disclosure, in my own life, I've sort of struggled with this, to buy less clothing, buy pieces that I reuse over and over again. And I mean, let's be real, you've all seen me. I wear the same 5 outfits every week. It's cool. I know it. But, right, part of that is because I'm lazy. Part of that is because I'm cheap. And she's definitely writing this book for an audience who has a lot more disposable income than I would imagine most people have to spend on clothing. And in the last chapter, I think she cites a figure that's the average professional woman spends something like $3,000 on clothing in a year, which I find totally wild. And I'm, again, I'm assuming that most of you do not have that kind of disposable income to spend on clothing, but I'm curious. And it would be great if we could have that conversation person to person. But here we are. So just a couple of graphics that I think are useful to keep in mind to illustrate what she's talking about. These come from the World Resource Institute. So cotton, we talked about cotton, rayon, linen, polyester. Cotton is one of the most water intensive products that you can find. One cotton shirt takes enough water for a person to drink for 2.5 years. And then on the flip side, polyester, because it is petroleum based, we know that the emissions from all polyester textiles in 2015 released the same amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as 185 coal-powered plants. So these aren't small numbers that we're talking about. This is a really major issue that collectively we're going to have to come to terms with as a society if we're serious about reducing climate change and reducing environmental emissions. And we know that that has to happen sooner rather than later. Naomi Klein, in your reading for next week, will give us a lot more specific numbers on kind of what's at stake and what the relationship is to capitalism. So she spells out in a lot more clarity what I'm hoping to sort of propose with Fashionopolis this week. And just as a further illustration of that, so the picture here is the Aral Sea, not the Ural, the Aral, in Uzbekistan. And essentially 50 years ago, Uzbekistan is not 50 years ago, probably like 30 years ago, decides that it wants to switch to intensive cotton farming. This is an illustration of how water intensive cotton farming is. So Uzbekistan is not a particularly moist environment. It's not quite desert, but it's not super far off from that. And you can see after several decades of growing cotton and using the sieve to irrigate those crops, you can see that the sea has almost completely disappeared. There have been efforts to sort of sustain that, and it's starting to kind of come back in small areas, but for the most part, it's completely dried out. And she also makes the point, which I find totally interesting, about Mongolia, and I know that this is the case with some of the Central Asian republics as well, is the number of goats that are used to create cashmere. So she illustrates this idea on page 168 that because there's this increased global demand for cashmere and for cashmere that's cheaper and affordable, and by affordable, again, she's referring to something that's probably not affordable for most people, but in the grand scheme of things, instead of a $500 sweater, a $90 sweater. So again, with the caveat that that's not really affordable anyway. So the yield and the number of goats that these farmers in Mongolia grew, they actually like quadrupled the number of animals that they had, which then leads to increased methane emissions, to desertification of that region, which again, like if you're thinking geographically, is not super far off from Uzbekistan, it's kind of like to the east next door, northeast. And then as it's kind of a circular nasty cycle, right? So as those emissions are going up, it's spurring on climate change, and climate change is causing further droughts. And then as, you know, Uzbekistan is trying to grow more cotton, and they're trying to grow grazing areas for these goats, these cashmere goats in Mongolia. The cycle just keeps taking and taking, and at some point, right, it's going to break. And we haven't reached that point yet, but it's not far off in the future. So these are really pertinent questions. And then the last thing that she doesn't talk about as much, but I think is important to mention, is the fact that when you donate clothing, you know, those big boxes that are out like behind the CVS or wherever, or if you take it to Goodwill or the Salvation Army or whatever, up to 90% of those get shipped off to developing nations. So they kind of call the best ones that they think they'll be able to resell, and you can go into stores and do that. When I lived on the West Coast, it's interesting, they were much, much better at doing that on the West Coast than they are out here. There were just massive, you know, secondhand retail stores everywhere. And it was kind of a culture shock for me to move to the East Coast and find relatively very, very few. And I've given you a source that you can look at here if you want to know more about this, but essentially what happens is those clothes get baled together. Some of them are used for like stuffing for car seats or mattresses or whatever, a lot of them get shipped as waste to, or as secondhand, kind of like second tier secondhand to developing countries. And what happens there is that those countries have their own clothing industries, and getting this flood of secondhand goods from the United States in particular means that those domestic industries are totally undercut. So this gives the example of Kenya, and over a few decades, nearly 500,000 jobs in the garment industry have been lost, and everything has been refocused on these secondhand clothes. And as people are losing jobs, right? If you think about this cycle, people no longer have industry jobs, they have less disposable money to spend, they're more reliant on these ultra cheap used secondhand goods. So there's definitely a problematic cycle that's happening globally that we also need to keep in mind, that it's impacting workers, not just in sweatshops, the workers that we might think of most obviously, but the entire industry globally is sort of out of balance. So a few big picture questions to think about, especially as you are working on your paper 3. So I like Dana Thomas's book. I think it's really interesting. I think that it's cool to read about a lot of different, experimental solutions that people are thinking about. If you're really interested in that and you want to look closer to home at some things that are going around, definitely look at the UMass Lowell Fabric Discovery Center, because they're actually doing a lot of really interesting research, especially I know some of you are engineers and have science majors. Definitely go and check that out. I know that they do tours every once in a while, so it's over there by mill number 5, I think. It's not on Jackson Street, it's on the one like parallel to Jackson Street. And you can go and look at like when I did the tour, so they had a project going on creating material that's more flame retardant, that's funded by the Department of Defense, and a lot of the funding for this technology does come from the Department of Defense, so that's another interesting element to think about. There's actually a shop on the first floor where they're reusing and kind of taking some of the waste from the industry and finding interesting ways to reuse it and recreate new kinds of products. So that sort of circular closed loop industry that she's talking about. There's all kinds of projects going on there. So it's super interesting. It's right here in our backyard when things are open again. Definitely check it out. But that said, so the book is super fascinating to me. It raises a lot of good questions, but one of the questions for me that is not super satisfactorily answered by Dana Thomas is, I think that she sort of takes as a given that people are so invested in fashion that they're going to keep their current levels of consumption. And so the answers that she primarily focuses on are finding better ways to consume. So finding products that are better for the environment, better for workers, better for artists and for people who hold intellectual property rights. But the one solution that she doesn't think about as much is finding ways to convince people that we should actually just buy less stuff. The things, part of the definition of fast fashion is that these are not high quality goods. They're not meant to last. So do you agree that it's not realistic to try to curtail current levels of consumption? What do you think about that? And on the same lines, how could we encourage industry and encourage consumers to actually reduce consumption instead of finding ways to consume better? So I mentioned when I lived on the West Coast, it was so easy to buy clothing secondhand. It still wasn't super easy. It takes time, I think, is one luxury that not everyone can afford because when you're buying secondhand, you have to flip through a lot more racks and things aren't organized as neatly as they are in a regular retail store. I can't see the jeans I like on the mannequin and then go to the pile with that label on it and pick out the size that I know I want, right? You have to just like have a little bit more patience. But what other solutions can you think of? And do you think we should be thinking about finding ways to consume less instead of just consuming better? I just think it's interesting. She sort of just assumes like, well, this is what fashion is. It's by definition about what's new and what's exciting. And so by definition, that seems to imply for her that we're always going to be buying the new thing. And that hasn't always been the case. She almost thinks of fashion as this like monolith, but we know throughout history, fashion has looked really, really different. We know that people with more money have always been able to afford more clothing and better clothing. But if you think about history of fashion industry in different cultures and different societies, it looks really different. And we have had a fashion industry for, hundreds of years essentially without having fast fashion. So what does it take um, to rethink ourselves as consumers? I think is the heart of the question that I want to think about. And then the other big question would be, what is the relationship that she's suggesting or that we want to suggest between labor issues and environmental issues? And this lays the groundwork for next week's reading. So we know, maybe you're reading the second half of the book this week and you're like, I don't really understand what this has to do with labor because it's not super obvious. So we know that all of the production processes that we're talking about have a labor impact and an environmental impact. And I'd like you to address both of those in some fashion in your third assignment. But essentially, so the example that I'm thinking of is if you have a sweatshop, essentially a factory in Bangladesh that does dyeing. They do intensive dyeing. They're using these synthetic dyes, as she talks about, rather than using indigo that's farmed. And because Bangladesh has lower environmental regulations, they're releasing a lot more of those dyes into the local water supply. Then that's not just bad for the workers who are in the plant, who are breathing in toxic chemicals. Maybe, I think we all are familiar as of, this crisis with the notion of PPE, personal protective equipment, having the proper masks, having gloves to protect your skin and yourself from toxic chemicals and other kinds of dangers. So if those employees don't have access to that, right, that's sort of level one. That's a very direct interaction between labor and environmental issues. However, there's a level two that's wider that means that if you have a town that is dominated by industry, or if you have a countryside that relies on a water supply that's tainted by industry, then not just the workers in that factory, but all of the people who are workers in the fields, in other factories, and who are drinking the water, who are living in that city, their families and their friends, everybody around them is impacted. And I think what my basic question is that also a labor issue? And should it be? And this is a question that we'll look at next week with a lot of unions really trying to puzzle this out. Another way to frame this would be, do corporations have a responsibility just to their employees, the people who directly work for them, or to the communities where they're located, as well as to consumers? Or is that too much to ask of them? So, last week we talked about this issue of supply chains, that companies will use subcontractors and subcontractors and say, we're not responsible to the employees who are down our supply chain. we just contracted with this organization. We didn't know what they were doing, and it's up to them to improve those. And this is another way, I think, to think about that same question. So do they have a responsibility to the broader community and to the planet? And I'm very interested to hear what you all think about it. Again, look out for an email from me in the next day or two. And um, you don't have to worry about posting this week. You can go back and catch up on your previous posts from the last week, work on assignment 3. As always, I will have office hours on Wednesday and Friday, but I'm totally available for phone or Zoom conversations or emails if you're having trouble with the paper or with anything else. So take care, stay healthy, and I will talk to you soon.